Ethics Untangled is made by the Idea Centre at the University of Leeds. It's a podcast about the difficult ethical questions we face in everyday life. In each episode, I interview someone, usually a philosopher, who's spent time thinking through one of these questions. And we try between us to work out what's going on. Chris McClean is a global lead for digital ethics at Avanade, a large tech innovation and consulting firm. He's also studying for his PhD at the Idea Centre, spending his time thinking about risk and trust relationships, especially in cases with a significant power imbalance, and whether people making the decisions are different from those exposed to the risk resulting from those decisions. At the end of this conversation, we explored some practical questions related to Chris's day job about what trust means for business and the professions and the digital realm. But in order to get there, we first got stuck into the deeper question of what trust means. Welcome to the podcast, Christopher.
Great to be here.
I wanted to start off by just asking you about your own background, really, and how you ended up being interested in this question about trust.
Yeah, thanks for that. So I started off really straight into business. I graduated undergrad with a marketing degree and went straight into marketing and market research and eventually consulting. And I just gravitated toward these topics where I was the person in the room that would alert people to risks, to harms, to potential downsides of things that they're doing if they're not careful. So I spent a lot of time around things like cybersecurity and privacy, sustainability and corporate social responsibility. And I kind of like this idea of thinking through how do organizations behave, and then how do people within those organizations make more responsible decisions, better risk-informed decisions, more ethical or sustainable decisions. So I spent a lot of time thinking about why do we associate with the companies that we do? Why do we think that they are worthy of our time and attention and investment? And it came down, to me, a lot of it came down to trust, right? Do I trust this brand? Do I trust this leader? Even in areas like technology, where I spend most of my time now, what makes me think that this technology is trustworthy enough to invest my time, to allow it to run portions of my life? And the more I thought about it, I think of trust as this kind of widespread force that really pervades our social interactions, our friendships, our romantic relationships, and then the relationships we have with other people and organizations. And I felt like there wasn't a whole lot of good discourse on trust. We talk about it in ways that I think are, they don't have the kind of depth and diligence of understanding that I think should be there for something as pervasive as trust.
Okay, great. And what we're going to talk about today is your account of what trust actually means. So why should we care what trust means? I mean, isn't it obvious what trust means?
Maybe it is, and maybe I'm wasting my time. But the way I see it, especially in the kind of the business and technical world, but even in politics and other areas where people talk about trust, I do feel like the way people even portraying some areas of, or I guess some air of expertise, there's still a kind of a lack of a common understanding of what trust is and how it plays out. And I'll give you an example. There's a PR communications firm every year that they publish what they call a trust barometer. And for the last several years, they've been talking about this kind of crisis of trust where people are losing trust in institutions like religious institutions, education, media, politics, even maybe friendship circles. Yeah. And I think if you think about trust as a kind of a feeling of optimism or a feeling of confidence, you might say, well, this is a bad thing. People are becoming more pessimistic. They like these institutions less and so forth. But the way I'm looking at trust as this kind of an evaluation of another party's power, or at least their the behavior that they portray or they display with this power. Right. The question is more like, do these institutions deserve the power that they have? Yeah. And so it's not a crisis of trust. It's more like an evaluation that these institutions are not behaving as well as they should. Right. So the nuance in how we talk about trust, how we understand trust, I think can actually have pretty big implications to how we engage with institutions and power at large.
That's really interesting. Is that the Edelman Trust?
Edelman, Edelman, yeah.
So we can maybe put a link to that in the show notes so people can follow and have a look at that. Brilliant. So we're interested in what trust means. One of the kind of central disputes, I suppose, among ethicists about trust is this question of whether we should think of trust as a mental state or a kind of action. So could you say a bit more about those two alternatives and why one might favor one or the other?
Yeah, it has gone back and forth quite a bit over the last, I guess, 40, 50 years or so of the trust literature. And I tend to think of it more as just a mental state, but there are certainly philosophers that would say it's just an action, or in many cases, I would say most cases, it's a combination of the two. So from a mental state perspective, a lot of philosophers talk about it as kind of a belief, as an attitude. You might think of it as optimism or confidence. But there are certainly philosophers that talk about it as an action, like you can decide to take an action and that action constitutes trust. So, for example, Richard Holton, maybe almost 40 years ago now, I guess over 30 years ago, said, you can decide to trust. And he described this idea of a trust circle, where somebody is standing in the center of a circle of colleagues. They decide to fall to one direction and trust that their colleagues will catch them and then stand them back upright gently. And what he was saying is that you might have a lack of confidence in your colleagues. You might think that they're not paying attention or they're not capable of catching you, but still decide to trust. You can still take that action, and that action is trusting. And then they will hopefully catch you and set you back upright. And in my mind, that doesn't seem like the best way to understand trust. I feel like you can decide to take the action as if you trusted them.
Right.
But if you don't have that mental state, if you're not thinking, I believe that they will catch me, I have a stance that they will catch me, it's very hard for me to see the argument that you're trusting as valid. And I'll give you another maybe very quick example.
Sure.
You might say to a friend, I trust you with my car, and you give them the keys to your car. I think I could very easily say, I trust my friend with my car, but I'm not going to give him the keys today because he doesn't have to drive anywhere, right? I can still have that mental state of trust without the action.
Right.
But it's very hard for me to say, I am trusting you with my keys, but I don't have the mental state. I would not call that trust. I would say, I'm giving you my keys, but I still distrust you, right? Maybe there's something else I'm going to do to maybe alleviate my concern. I'm going to have a bigger insurance policy. I'm going to do something else because I distrust you. But that action of handing my keys over, for me, it's very hard to think of that as trusting.
Right. So do we need another word for that, whatever it is?
Well, I think we might. I just, the thing that I'm concerned with is that mental state. Like what is going through my head. And then there's an action that's informed by that mental state. There are dozens and dozens of different actions I could take on the basis of that mental state of trust, but the actions don't constitute trust in themselves. And there are all kinds of ways that I might have trust. I might feel trust toward that person without actually taking the action.
You've said a bit about why you think trust is a mental state, but the specific kind of mental state that you think is the best account of trust is a stance. So could you say a bit about why you think trust is a stance as opposed to, I suppose, something like an attitude or a belief or something like that?
Yeah, it's a tricky point, and it might take a bit of time to work through, but certainly a lot of the philosophers, I would say most of the philosophers in this space talk about it as a belief or as an attitude, going back to Annette Bayer, this idea of it being sort of confidence or optimism. And I do think this is actually something that Holton got right. He talked about trust as either similar to or maybe even part of a participant stance, which is kind of a more complex framework with which you interact with a person, kind of how you treat them, how you approach them, how you engage with them.
Right.
So I think that complexity of the framework, even within that framework, your attitudes might change slightly. If this is maybe a friend that you trust, your attitude toward that friend can change over the course of a day, but you still kind of maintain that trust.
Yes.
So I think that's one piece that I think it works very well with trust as a stance. And the other piece of it that maybe I've spent a little bit less time on is For me, the idea of a stance has this implication that you either have an intention or at least an expectation of engagement.
Right.
So if you see somebody, maybe read about somebody in the press, or you see somebody on TV, maybe even a fictional character on TV, you might have an attitude toward that person. That person is impressive, they're reliable. You have these attitudes toward them. But for me, a stance has this kind of expectation of engagement, or maybe intention of engagement, that I can foresee interacting with that person, and I kind of have a sense for how that engagement would go because of this stance, rather than what I would think of as an attitude as maybe a little bit more fleeting of a feeling.
That's really interesting. I suppose, so if you're going to say trust is a belief or an attitude, it does seem like you can have beliefs about people and attitudes about people who you don't know, and you've got no expectation that you're going to engage with them in any way, fictional people or just, celebrities or politicians or something like that.
I think that's right. Yeah.
But then again, yes, with politicians, I suppose there is going to be a question about trust, right?
Yeah, if there's a politician that I think is very impressive and I expect that I might vote for her or him, that feels to me more like a stance, right? Like I have an intention around that interaction, or some way I'm going to behave based on that stance, as opposed to I might read in the press about some foreign minister at a country that I don't expect to go to anytime soon. I might be impressed by them, but I don't have this kind of sense of how I would interact with them or expectation that interaction would ever actually happen.
Yeah, sure. Okay. And specifically, you say that trust is a stance towards someone as being a good steward of power. So again, could you explain what you mean by this?
Sure. And I think this is the piece where I'm really focusing my attention. I think there are so many different accounts of trust in the literature right now, going back for the last 40 years, starting with Annette Baer. And for me, a lot of the descriptions, a lot of the accounts of trust sounds to me like reasons you might come to have this stance of trust. So you might have a belief that this other person has a commitment and a reliance on that person to meet that commitment. So that would be Catherine Hawley. And then you might have an attitude of optimism, and you might have a belief that somebody has goodwill toward you, or at least they don't have ill will toward you. And that's Bayer going back to 1986. So there's a lot of these kind of different accounts, and in my mind, those are reasons that you might come to have a stance of trust. But it all comes down to whether or not in my mind, this all comes down to whether or not you believe that this other party is going to handle some kind of power with responsibility. In my words, that they would be a good steward of that power. So again, if I give you the keys to my car, I'm giving you some kind of power. I'm thinking in my mind that you're going to handle that power responsibly. You're going to be a good steward of that power. If I trust a street vendor who's trying to sell me a sandwich, they don't have a whole lot of power over my life, but they have a very particular power, which is they're going to prepare and hand me some food. And I believe, I think that they're going to be a good steward of the power that they have, that in some way makes me vulnerable, to their decisions and their whims, the discretionary power, as Bayer would describe it. And so this stewardship of power idea is an articulation, an evaluation that in the context with which I'm trusting them to make a sandwich, to drive my car, to watch my children, to lead my country, I think that they will do a good job. They will be a good steward of the power that they have in that capacity.
Okay. You were using the word belief there. So I was wondering whether this stance towards someone as a good steward of power is distinct from a belief that someone is a good steward of some power. So could you have this stance towards someone without really believing that they're a good steward of power?
I don't think so. And certainly, the way that I'm articulating it, I might use a word like belief. And I do feel like that is one way that you might come to have a stance. You might have a stance because you've done a lot of due diligence and you know a whole lot about this person. This person that's selling me a sandwich, I don't know a whole lot about them, but I might come to a stance because I think that this city has a very rigorous health department and they have very rigorous checks, and there's a big penalty if people serve you food that's unhealthy. So I would come to a stance based on a belief about this person, but also the kind of ecosystem around them that controls their behavior or punishes them if they have bad behavior. So you might have beliefs, you might have strong relationships, But I have a really hard time thinking that you would have a stance that another person is going to be a good steward of some power without some belief about the reason that you have that stance.
Yes,
it'd be very hard to say, I believe that they're bad. I believe that they probably don't make sandwiches in a very healthy way, but I'm still going to take the stance that they're going to. That would be Holton's idea, that you can decide to trust and you can just act as though you're trusting. And that doesn't seem plausible to me. I don't think you can overcome a disbelief or belief against somebody and act as though you trust them and still call that trust.
Interesting. Do you think like the way we interact with children might be an exception here? So I'm often thinking about, I'm a parent, I'm often thinking about, how these kinds of ideas apply to parenting. And it strikes me that quite often you might, with a child, not believe that they're going to be worthy of your trust. You might think they're not going to keep their promises or keep their commitments or whatever, but you might still trust them or act as though you trust them in order to kind of bring it about that they become trustworthy, right? So you're kind of trying to encourage the right kinds of attitudes in them.
I think that happens all the time, but I would still make the distinction there that you have a stance about their use of power, their stewardship of power. You're going to say, you know what, I don't mind if you walk down to your friend's house. I think you're going to be gone for 4 hours, and I will treat you as though I believe you're going to do the right thing. I'm going to take an action that is let you go. I'm not going to follow you down the street. I'm not going to call your friend's house every half hour. You are behaving in a way that makes them feel like they trust that you trust them and so forth. But you're not changing your mind about that. You are not believing something different, but you're not taking a different stance from the mental perspective. You're taking an action as though you had the stance that they're going to be a good steward of that power.
Sorry, so you're not actually trusting them. You're acting as though you trust them.
I think that's right.
Yeah. Okay, good. If trust is a stance towards someone as being a good steward of some power, is it always a power over the truster? So you sort of talked about, people having, goodwill towards you or having your own interests at heart. Do you always trust somebody to be a good steward of their power over you specifically, or can you trust somebody in terms of their power over some other person or group of people?
I think this is a critical distinction. I think it's not necessarily power over you, right? So if you go back, again, Annette Bayer, she talks about trust as letting someone take care of something that you care about. And in that action that you're taking, you become vulnerable. You're accepting vulnerability to this other person's discretionary power. So I feel like she's right in all of that, and almost all of that capacity. But in my mind, when you act on trust, again, if I give you the car keys, if I feel like you're a trustworthy individual and I give you my car keys based on that trust that I feel for you, I have some vulnerability, right? I like my car. I don't want you to crash it. I don't want you to, crash into my house as you try to pull away. But in giving you the car keys, I am also making other people vulnerable, right? Let's say my trust is misplaced and you're a terrible driver. Right. My neighbors are vulnerable. My neighbors' children and their pets are vulnerable because of the action that I took based on my trust. Right. So I do feel like there's a really important implication here that when we think about who we trust, when we maybe evaluate our trusting relationships, a lot of that is going to be based on our own vulnerability. But here's where that sort of the moral implication comes in, which is when I act on that trust, I should also maybe in the back of my mind be thinking, is this person a good steward of the power that I am giving them? I'm acquiescing or I'm not challenging, in so much as they're also making other people vulnerable based on my action. Yeah. And so there's that's where I think that the moral implication starts to play.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Okay. And do you think your view of trust can make sense of the emotional component of trust? It feels like trust is to some extent an emotional phenomenon, right? When somebody breaches our trust, it's not just that our kind of beliefs about them change. It's that we feel let down, we feel betrayed, we might be angry or resentful or something like that.
Yeah, it's a great question. And certainly a lot of people have spent some time on this topic. it's my supervisor, Andy Curtin, calls it betrayability, right? Like the idea of trust is that you have this kind of interaction that has the ability to be betrayed, and you have that sort of emotional depth of feeling there. And I feel like that is a very common, very frequent component of trusting interactions, but it's not necessary for trust to be at play. I do feel like probably if you are taking a stance, or if you have a stance, there's very likely going to be some kind of emotional slant to it, right? You're going to feel that. But there's a very wide degree of, again, what Andy would call betrayability. So if I'm trusting a street vendor to make a sandwich, and they maybe have ingredients in there that I don't very much like, or maybe that make me sick, I'm going to feel upset. I'm going to maybe be mad at myself. I might even be angry at the city because their health department is not as rigorous as they should be. But my sense of betrayal, it may be there, right? I'd have a hard time saying it would not happen at all. But it's very different than if I trust you to watch my children and you run away with them, or you put their lives in danger. That's a betrayal. That's a clear betrayal. I trusted you because you're my friend. I trusted you because you have credentials. I have a lot of reasons for trusting, and those come into play. And those are the things that I think make trust betrayable, right? As opposed to the trust that I have for a vendor on the street, or a cab driver or something like that. It's hard for me to put the same kind of emotional import to those kind of interactions.
Great. Okay. Thank you. So we've got a good picture of what your view of what trust means is now. So you think it's a stance towards someone as being a good steward of some power. So what are the implications of that view then? Why does that matter?
Yeah, I think a couple of things. As I mentioned before, when we talk about this sort of in society, there might be this crisis of trust where people are just less trusting of each other, of individuals, or of institutions. I think if we think in terms of trust as an evaluation of power or stewardship of power, we have a different approach to, let's say, fixing the problem. If we believe, as I do, that trust is very important, having a good network of trust allows us to live a better life. We can accomplish more if we have good people around us that we trust. We can have people watch our kids while we go to the movies, or we can trust individuals to represent us in government, and they're going to do a good job. Or we trust corporations to act responsibly with respect to the environment or the social network and things like that. I feel like trust is very important. And if we are going to solve the problem where people are less trusting, if we think about it in terms of power, we should be really thinking about what kind of power are we giving or acquiescing or not challenging with other people or with institutions. And we can think of, okay, this corporation does a very good job at this particular thing, but not these other particular things. And maybe they need a little bit less power in society.
Right.
Or this government is very good at a couple of things, but we don't want government in every aspect of our lives. Right. We trust them for certain things. So we're giving them certain types of power.
Yes, good. So the immediate thought might be, well, okay, if trust is about being a good steward of power, then in order to create more trust in society, we need organizations and individuals to be better stewards of power. But actually what you're saying is that sometimes what we need is for them to have a bit less power.
That's exactly right.
Just to be good stewards of the power that they have, but only have power where it's appropriate for them to have power.
I think that's right.
Yeah. Yeah. And is there anything else to say about the implications of this view of trust for business and the professions?
Yeah, and that's a lot of what I do professionally for work. That I work for a very large tech consulting firm, and so we, as a company, we build all kinds of different types of technologies. Hardware and software, and we're doing some work in AI and blockchain, and we did some metaverse work and things like that. And I think for me, a lot of the underlying decisions around technology come down again to trust. And for me, the question is, do I have this kind of stance toward the people that are involved in designing and developing and implementing and operating this technology? So as an individual, I feel comfortable adopting it engaging with it, letting it run portions of my life. I think of things like a driverless vehicle.
Yeah.
And some people are going to make a decision like, oh, I trust this driverless vehicle. I think it's going to make basically good decisions, as a proxy for all the people that designed and developed it. I trust it enough to get behind the wheel, and I trust maybe my kids or my spouse to be in the vehicle with me. And then you think about that kind of that power, that evaluation of power that I've been talking about. You should also be kind of thinking, okay, what about all the other people that are potentially vulnerable because of my trust that I've placed in this in this driverless vehicle. So from the technology perspective, I think this is going to come up a whole lot more often as we think about AI, even though it's not itself its own autonomous agent, at least not yet. We can still think of these kind of systems as proxies for the people that built it, that designed and developed and implemented it, and so forth. So when I think of trust, if we think about it in terms of whether or not the people that brought this technology into the world, are they good stewards of the power that they had as they were putting it together? And then there's also this kind of other, wider network of people that are involved, regulators and auditors and risk managers and other people that it's their job to kind of oversee the potential risks and potential harms. Do I believe that they are doing the right thing in their positions of power, right? Are the regulators stepping in when they need to? Are the politicians and so forth doing the right thing to protect us against, these potentially harmful technologies? So this idea of trust is, at least in my mind, a good way to start to think about the people. Each individual will have some kind of a role to play in making these kind of technologies or these kind of businesses good stewards that we feel comfortable, we feel confident engaging.
Yeah. Okay, great. One of the things that I was interested in is a question about situations where it looks like we're in a trust relationship or some kind of relationship of vulnerability, which we could naturally think of as being trusting, where we actually don't have any choice or have very little choice about being in that kind of relationship. So I think about this in terms of like banks, right? So I think in that Edelman Trust Barometer, at least sometimes bankers come up as scoring very low in terms of trust. And I certainly know people who just think bankers as a class are completely untrustworthy. And yet they have bank accounts, right? But partly that's because it's very difficult to even have a job or exist in society without having a bank account. So if somebody's in that position where they think that bankers are totally untrustworthy, but yet they seem to be entrusting some important aspects of their well-being to those people, perhaps because essentially they have no choice. Does your view imply that that's not really trust, or what would you say about that?
Yeah, it could actually depend on the individual. I can't be in the head of everybody that banks with large institutions, but I do feel like in a lot of ways the evaluation is, do I trust them enough, right? And it doesn't have to be. I guess the reasons for that trust don't have to only consist of the evaluation of that individual institution's characteristics, because as I mentioned, you have this kind of network of society, you have regulators, and I at least trust the system enough to know that if my bank defrauded me in some way, I have recourse. Yes. Right. So that's a reason that I have this stance of trust. They are good enough stewards of this power to hold on to my investments, to maybe give me some advice about my investments, or at least to be, to have my money available when I go to the ATM. I think they're good enough at that. Yeah. And if they don't fulfill that kind of promise, I know that there's a whole system of recourse that I have, that I can, sue them, or I could call them out, or maybe I have like a social media account where I could call out their bad behavior. I have a lot of different reasons that I come to have that stance. Yeah. So I might trust them enough, but there are certainly cases where you believe you have this stance that they are not good stewards of that power. We are all in a position to challenge power, right? I didn't give them that power. And again, going back to the earlier literature, the idea of trust as accepting vulnerability, putting something you care for in the hands of somebody else, you don't always have that choice, right? I'm not putting myself in a vulnerable position on purpose with respect to let's say the police. They're an authority, and I had nothing to do with that, but I can still decide, or I can still have a stance. Are they trustworthy or not? And if they're not, if I don't have that stance, I can challenge their power. I can protest. I can write letters. I can drum up hopefully support to my side, and we can all challenge that kind of power. Yeah. So there's a lot of different ways that you can behave based on a stance of distrust toward power that you actually had nothing to do with, that you didn't create, or you didn't acquiesce in any way.
Right. So there are ways in which we can be vulnerable to some group of people or institution or something without actually trusting them, right? So it's possible to be in a position of vulnerability without having any choice about that, and not having any of the kind of participant stance towards those people.
Yeah, and we haven't really talked too much about distrust, but it's, in my mind, it's basically the opposite stance, right? I have a stance that this other party is not a good steward of that power, right? Even if I'm walking down the street and I see a couple characters that seem unseemly, I could have a stance saying, I think they have potential power over me. They might have physical power over me, and I don't think they're going to handle that power very well, right? I think I'm vulnerable, and my action would be, I'm going to hopefully escape the situation. So you have a stance of distrust, and you can certainly have that kind of stance of distrust toward politicians, toward banks, toward other institutions, and you can not do anything. You can choose not to act on that stance of distrust. But if you do, there are certainly options. You have recourse, or you can do things like protest or otherwise challenge their power.
Right. Great. And the last question I have is, so you're interested in digital ethics specifically, right? So how do these issues of trust play out in the digital arena?
Yeah, as I mentioned, a lot of how I think about trust in technology is, do we have confidence that as we adopt new technologies, as we engage with them, that we can think of them as kind of proxies for all the people that designed and developed and implemented and operate those technologies, and that's sort of, again, that network of oversight, audit and security and regulation and things like that. So this idea of trust, I think, is still very, very important. That kind of undergirds the way we interact with technology. And so in my job specifically, I'm working with the people that are doing that kind of design and development and implementation work, and making sure as much as possible they are good stewards of the power that they have. When they're making decisions about how they build an interface, how they build back-end systems, what kind of security or privacy controls they have, they're making responsible decisions that, again, they're good stewards of the power that they've been given or that they've come into. And if I'm evaluating them as doing the right thing, as being good stewards of that power, then I feel like we are building what I would consider more trustworthy technology. So that's a big focus of my professional role right now.
Okay, great. Well, that's all we have time for. So Christopher McClean, thank you very much for being on the podcast.
Good to be here.
If you enjoyed this episode of Ethics Untangled, please like and subscribe and recommend us to your friends. The podcast is edited by Mark Smith at Leeds Media Services, and our music is by Kate Wood. Ethics Untangled is brought to you by the Idea Centre, a specialist unit for teaching, research, training and consultancy in applied ethics at the University of Leeds. We offer master's programmes in healthcare ethics and applied and professional ethics, and PhDs available full or part-time and face-to-face or by online learning. We also offer consultancy and training services for business and the professions, including help with the difficult ethical issues faced by your organisation, commissioned research projects, and online or face-to-face CPD. If you'd like to find out more about these or any of our other activities, please visit our website at ahc.leeds.ac.uk/ethics.